everyone, and welcome to the last presentation, part 3 of the 3-video series for week 2's required viewing. This last presentation is going to be on values and the connection to social welfare. So when we think about values, we often think about ethics, and sometimes that's related to a sense of morality. But morality often has a religious connotation that's not necessary for having values or ethics. Another way to think about values is in terms of right and wrong. Values are what tell us or guide us into what's considered right or wrong behavior. And that's what we're really talking about here, choices and behavior in terms of policy decisions. But we also have to understand that values are so embedded in who we are that they often direct all of our behaviors. So whether we wake up in the morning and decide to dress professionally or casually depends on the situation that we're going to be in during the day, of course, but it's also guided by how we value those situations. Another example, everyday example, is speeding. How much do we value our lives? How much do we value the lives of our passengers, the lives of the people on the street when we're speeding? It may not seem like we're making these conscious decisions based on our values, but they do influence this behavior. Of course, with social welfare, what we're interested in is behavior having to do with voting for policies, sometimes voting for in elections that will lead to representatives and legislators who will pass certain laws and policies. It's not to say that we're not concerned about your speeding. If you are speeding, I hope everybody drives safely. But for the purposes of this class, that was just an example of how values affect everyday decisions. And then for social welfare macro practice, we will focus on policies and laws when it comes to decision making. So let's look at an example about how values can guide our decision making, our views of situations, etc. Oh, before I do that though, I just wanted to just make a note that although many people share the same values, when it comes to defining social problems, like we talked about in the previous video, and then what to do about those social problems, then values can lead to differences of opinion. So let's use the example of poverty to demonstrate this. Here we have person A, and this person's values regarding personal responsibility and individualism might lean this person toward thinking that it's an individual's fault if they are poor because they're not working hard enough, and therefore society has no responsibility to help them. Person B, on the other hand, could be someone who values social justice and believes that there are inequalities in our current society that make it difficult for even some to, no matter how hard they work, to rise above poverty, and thus society should have a responsibility to help. Who is right? Well, person A thinks that they're right, and person B thinks that they're right. And there's a whole bunch of people who think like person A, and there's a whole bunch of people who think like person B. And that, of course, gets to the whole polarization issue in this country, which we will definitely talk about later. But for now, we're just trying to understand how values affect how we see issues, how we define them as either conditions or problems, and what we think should be done about the issues. Okay, so now I'd like to go over some of the American social values that are in the Day and Schiele text, just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of knowing what they are, because these are really important, as you'll see when we get to the history portion of the class. In terms of really seeing how these values play out in all the decisions that have been made with regard to social welfare policies. The first one we'll go over is the Judeo-Christian charity value. Even though the term Judeo-Christian is used, please don't mistake this as me saying that only Jewish and Christian people have these values. Of course, there are many different religions that espouse this value, which is really about social justice. So with this value, The belief is that failure should not be blamed on the individual, but on the social structures that prevent success. So if we think about, for example, affirmative action policies, those are based on this charity/social justice value of believing that there is not a level playing field, and therefore policies need to address that structure in society. And when I say structure, I mean structural oppression in the form of sexism, racism, ageism, ableism, all of those isms. So the view here, when I was talking about these structural inequalities, is that we have these different systems that make up the structure of society. We have the criminal justice system, the health system, child welfare, education, etc. And they're all linked in this web together, interlocking, much like those social institutions that we talked about in one of the videos. But what happens here in the case of structural oppression, whether it be racism, etc., is that they are working against certain groups of people, disadvantaging them, preventing them from upward mobility or inclusion in all of society's benefits. So based on this value, policies need to be enacted that address these structural inequalities in order to achieve social justice. The next value in the book that's discussed is democratic egalitarianism and individualism. So when it comes to democratic egalitarianism, this is the idea that all citizens are equal before the law and no one has privileges based on class, heritage, wealth, or other factors that are irrelevant to citizenship. So it's essentially the idea that we have a level playing field. However, the social work perspective is that the level playing field does not exist. And this cartoon kind of describes that belief. Here we have two people who are in a race together. One person may have a couple of hurdles, but the other, the person of color, has many more hurdles to overcome in order to achieve the same success. And there's a sentiment from the opponent that is, what's the matter? It's the same distance. So this is an example of how the playing field really is not level. And then in terms of individualism, this harkens back to that pioneer sort of spirit, and one of my favorite TV shows, although it's very problematic in many ways, Bonanza. So, and all these depictions of the Wild West and the pioneer spirit, which is really the idea that individual effort and personal motivation by which any American can achieve success is a reality. So in terms of policies, really a lot of our social welfare policies are based on individualism, the idea of picking yourself up by your bootstraps, even if you don't have boots, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, is a very common value in the country. A policy that can be related to democratic egalitarianism in terms of trying to provide some sort of level playing field is public education. Okay. Next, we have the Protestant work ethic, which includes the idea of individualism and then capitalism as well. The Protestant work ethic is the idea that personal achievement and worth are based on work. So there is a morality in work, a morality in wealth, a morality in patriotism. Any type of economic gain is moral, and it kind of views work as a sort of end unto itself. So I kind of think about this in terms of when I was a student, and any time that I took some time off to go to a movie, or any time that I wasn't doing schoolwork, I felt guilty. And that's the embodiment of the Protestant work ethic, that guilt. In terms of capitalism, we'll go over this in more detail when we go over the history of the country, but essentially the idea is taking capital and investing it in production, in the production of goods or services, which includes a base of workers that can work for a price that is cheap enough that profit can be made by the selling of those goods. But the idea is that competition lowers prices so that capitalism is good for the consumer. And all of this leads to ownership of private property and the accumulation, and the accumulation of more capital and more wealth that can then be reinvested, and the cycle sort of continues. But for our purposes, we have to kind of think of it, well, we don't have to, but this is the social work perspective in terms of who are the people who are in that base of workers and who are the ones who are achieving wealth through this system. And as we talked about in the previous video about economic justice, this is really at the heart of it in terms of capitalism, and in particular laissez-faire capitalism, which we'll go over, as I said, later. Okay, next one is social Darwinism. The idea here is that the theory of Darwin regarding evolution is sort of applied to those who are impoverished, those who are seen as less than and therefore unworthy of help. And it's better not to help them and instead let them essentially die. So it's the belief that state support of those impoverished is against the laws of economic nature, and that the lives of people who are economically unfit should not be saved by giving them public assistance. Don't have too much to say about that now, but we will talk about this in class. Okay, the New Puritanism. This has to do with the Puritan values of chastity, honesty in dealings, abstinence from things that are immoral. I was actually going to list a whole bunch of them, but then I just decided to come up with no to a whole bunch of things having to do with improper behavior. And then also part of this is national insularity, which we now call xenophobia. So in terms of policy, all of the laws that make drugs illegal, back when we had prohibition against alcohol, all of the undocumented immigrant laws and immigrant laws in general, trying to restrict immigration, all of those are part of the New Puritanism. And I couldn't resist by putting this up there because, it is scary what's happening right now when it comes to social welfare policies and where we're headed from a social work perspective. Okay, patriarchy, which is the superiority of men over women. Well, it's the belief of superiority of men over women, and the system of power and authority that was created based on that belief, where power and authority are vested in men. And we can see this in the fact that male authority permeates every institution that we have. So I think this kind of sums it up really well. It says, okay, gentlemen, next on the agenda, should we give women equality? So the idea is that men get to decide whether women are given equal rights. Over the years, we've had many social movements that have tried to gain equal rights for women. There was the first women's rights movement, which was seeking the right to vote. We had the second women's rights movement in the 70s. There was the Year of the Woman in the 90s, and the Me Too movement of today. And through the years, there's been a lot of progress made, but obviously the fact that we have the Me Too movement right now and all the problems with harassment clearly show that sexism still exists and that we do continue to live in a patriarchal society. I guess I could put that picture of The Handmaid's Tale here too, but I won't. White privilege, belief in the superiority of the white race over others. And this one I know can be a little bit difficult for some to believe, but the social work perspective does acknowledge and recognize that white privilege does exist and permeates all of the structures in our society, and that we need to work towards dismantling those structures. So when it comes to white privilege, it's, like I said, superiority, this belief of superiority, which is really racism, but it's also the belief that white or European American or Anglo-Saxon, whatever you want to term it, that those norms and mores are universal and superior to other cultural prescriptions and interpretations. That's from the textbook. But essentially, this gives advantage to some and disadvantages others. As I said, this can be kind of a difficult concept, but I think the Black Lives Matter movement really has highlighted the continual existence of white privilege in this country. The idea with Black Lives Matter has been unfortunately misunderstood, mostly by those who have white privilege, to mean that, well, only Black Lives Matter. And that's certainly not the case. And so when such people counter with all lives matter, it really negates and invalidates the whole purpose of the movement, which is to say that in current American society, Black lives are treated as if they don't matter. And that's why there's the movement towards getting Black lives to matter in this country. When people say all lives matter, yes, of course, we want all lives to matter. But the problem is that in this country, certain groups are treated as if their lives don't matter. Immigrants are another group. I can name many others. The problem here is that when a person is accustomed to privilege, equality can feel like oppression. I love this quote because it really highlights the issue with the current struggles that we're having in terms of race and racism. And when I say current, I don't mean that they're new. They're embedded in obviously a very long and entrenched history of structural racism and oppression. Even though talking about these issues and these values can be difficult, it is really important that we're clear on what white privilege means, what the Black Lives Matter movement means, what the oppression against immigrants is really about and what it means. And ultimately, in terms of solutions, it really has to do with, again, changing these values, changing these perceptions where people think that equal rights means that rights will be taken away from them. And I like this quote. I don't know where it came from. I found it on the internet. I wish I could give credit to it. I did not write it, but I like it because it says it's not a pie. Taking a piece of pie leaves less for the person, but equal rights is not in the formula of a pie. Everyone can have equal rights. Oh, yes, we're going to actually talk about historically accumulated white privilege, which is the idea about advantages that are passed on through generations. We'll talk about this actually either next week or the week before when we talk about structural racism. But I just wanted to mention it here that this isn't a new phenomenon and it isn't something that's just current. Okay. Marriage and the nuclear family. I think this picture kind of sums it all up in terms of the value. And this was from Leave It to Beaver. And the idea is that you have two parents who are married and have two, maybe three kids, 2.5 kids, and a dog and maybe a cat, I don't know. But in any case, this is the ideal. And any deviation from this, in the sense of domestic partnership, cohabitating, lesbian, a couple, anything that quote unquote deviates from this picture is disvalued. Let's see, the American ideal. So this one is basically about otherism, and we see it a lot in modern society here in America, where if you don't look a certain way, then you're considered less than. So right now, a big quote unquote other has to do with people who are Muslim or who are immigrant. But also, let's not forget the American ideal in terms of lookism, in terms of also body image, or not just body image, but just bodies in general. I mean, there's a whole book here written called Fat Shame, Stigma and the Fat Body in American Culture. So your book lists some of the attributes of the American ideal in terms of, perhaps blonde hair, blue eyes, fit, etc. And clearly, folks who don't look like that, who maybe look like those in these pictures, are not going to be part of that ideal, and therefore attempts will be made to exclude them from participation in society. So these are all of the American social values, and we can see how values shape social or policy when we consider the various approaches and perspectives that can be taken. As your book mentions, our perspectives on social work come from diverse values that determine what we think social work and social workers should do, what the causes of problems are, the purposes and functions of social welfare policy, and what the results of those policies and interventions should be. There are two main perspectives in social welfare and social welfare policy: the residual perspective and the institutional perspective. Sometimes the residual perspective is called selective, and the institutional perspective is called universal. So those mean the same thing. Residual is the same as selective, institutional is the same as universal. Let's talk about the residual perspective first. Residual perspective informs the vast majority of our social welfare policy. This is the idea that social welfare in the form of interventions, treatment, etc., should only be in response to failures and or temporary breakdowns in the healthy operation of the primary systems, that is the market, the economy, family, political systems, or any one of their specialized subsystems. So in that sense, then, society should help people, but only in emergency cases and only if no other systems can help. And, systems can mean social institutions here as well. Now, when we think about this in terms of the residual perspective, we can think of it being based on at least two of the American social values: the Protestant work ethic and individualism. So take a minute, pause the video, and think about how the Protestant work ethic and individualism affect or drive the residual perspective. Okay, now see if you had it right. So when it comes to both of these, they're related to individual responsibility, doing things for oneself, and working as a moral value. So when we consider residual policies like public assistance, we can see these two at work with in terms of welfare to work requirements, in terms of not giving enough cash assistance to actually lift people out of poverty because we want them to do it by themselves, etc., etc. In contrast, we have the institutional or universal perspective, which is the opposite. It's for everybody. And the only criteria for receiving help is that you have to be a member of society. If you're a member of society, you are entitled to help. So any programs that come from this are universally applied to everybody. A good example of this is Social Security. There's no criteria in terms of need, and it's not for emergency situations. So that's why I said in class that it's sort of the gold standard, because it's based on social justice in the sense that there's no structures in society in place to help the elderly stay out of poverty. And in that case, we're not blaming the elderly or older persons for needing Social Security. Now, one caveat is that you do have to contribute into the system to receive it, but we'll talk about the nitty-gritty and the specifics and all of that later. For our purposes here, it's just in contrast to residual policies that are restrictive. Another way of thinking about residual versus institutional perspectives is how policies based on each view the cause of the social problem. So any policy decision that gets made in terms of what to do is based on the view of that cause, and that view of the cause is based on our values. So think about it in this way. There's two quotes here that I think really sum this up really well. Social problem is seen as residual when it is the consequence of the occasional yet inevitable lapse of a primary system from its normal healthy operation. A problem is seen as institutional when it occurs under any conceivable social arrangement because it is part of the irreducible imperfection of society. Now, there are other perspectives, and your book goes over them briefly. I'm just going to list them here with the page numbers just to call attention to them to make sure that you are familiar with them before you come to class on Tuesday. So there's functionalism, conflict theory, Marxism and the socialist perspective, feminism, which includes socialist feminism, radical feminism, feminist welfarist, and the Afrocentric paradigm. So we'll be going over these, especially functionalism and conflict theory, because those are two of the main theories that underlie macro practice. And that's all I have to say about that. Here are all the images that I used if you want to look them up. And yeah, there were a lot, I guess. Wow. Okay, that's it. The end. And for real this time, at least for this part of the series. Thanks again for watching.